This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome, everybody, to Boston 9/11's Truth. Today is Sunday, August 3rd. We have a very special guest from Morocco, of scholars for 9/11 Truth and a truth jihadist, Middle East researcher, Kevin Barrett, PhD. Welcome, Kevin.
Hey, thanks, Susan. It's good to be with you guys. Haven't done any of these 9/11 Truth meetings for quite a while now, so it's good to be back, and some of these faces I haven't seen for years.
Well, tell us a little more about yourself and what you've been up to lately. I was just listening to one of your recent podcasts from last month. But if you could just take it from
Yeah, sure. So I haven't really been doing any 9/11 scholarship or not even activism per se, although I've been sort of trying to boost Captain Dan Hanley's work. He's a pilot whistleblower currently living in Pakistan, and pushing this effort to try to get Muslims active around the issue. But I've sort of helped to promote that a little bit. But my days as a 9/11 geek are behind me at this point. I do occasionally have people who want to discuss or sometimes argue 9/11 related issues, and I keep going back to 9/11 on my broadcasts and False Flag Weekly News, the weekly news show I do on Rumble. So I'm still kind of keeping up with the issue, but not really completely focusing on it. Since I moved to Morocco 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, it seems like, I guess, right after I got here at the end of July, beginning of August 2 years ago. And then a couple of months later, the October 7th Al-Aqsa flood operation happened, when the Palestinian resistance raided the occupied Palestine and started this genocidal war that's been raging ever since. And I guess I've actually been paying a little more attention to that issue than to 9/11, but I think they're related. And the completely irrational, extreme, over the top, completely grotesquely unethical and mendacious behavior of the Israelis, and of course their American backers or captives, occupied America, whatever. That behavior really does reflect the reality that I eventually came to accept after years of following the David Ray Griffin interpretation of 9/11 to some extent, and that is that the United States is essentially occupied by Israel, and that 9/11 was done by the state of Israel and its American loyalists. And so where I've come around to at this point is seeing that there's this huge problem of people, basically Zionists, and primarily Jewish Zionists, with a certain number of Christian and secular Zionist dupes, who've gotten involved in what really amounts to almost a doomsday cult, in which they're trying to commit genocide in the Holy Land and steal as much as they can, with the most extreme, egregious chutzpah and just over the top immorality, and complete contempt for morality. And that effort to essentially commit a satanic genocide in land that is holy to the majority of the Earth's population is the underlying reason why 9/11 happened. That something as extreme and crazy as 9/11 is only going to happen if people who are gambling on it and think they have something to gain from it and are willing to do such a risky and terrible thing. It requires that kind of really extreme and outlandish mindset, as well as a lockdown on the mainstream media and American political institutions. And that's what the Zionists have. And so since I've been here and I've been closely following the events in and around the struggle to liberate occupied Palestine, I have become more convinced of that interpretation that I had arrived at actually by probably 2010-ish, that in fact we should look at 9/11 not as an inside job, but as an outside job. It was an attack on America by the state of Israel. And that just as the struggle to liberate the Holy Land from these satanic Zionist lunatics is the most crucial international issue of our time, as the young people are waking up and seeing, the struggle to liberate the United States of America from that same Zionist occupation, which operates in so many disgusting, horrific ways, such as the collection of child porn blackmail on America's key leadership, as illustrated by the Epstein scandal, is the key American political issue. So we need an American intifada and an American resistance, uh, and we need the kind of dedication to overthrowing the satanic Zionist oligarchs who rule America. We need that from Americans in the same way that we need the resistance fighters fighting to liberate Palestine. So there's my opening statement, and I'd be happy to take your questions because I don't want to go on rambling and ranting all night, and I'm sure some people will have some questions about what I just said.
Well, I've muted everybody while you're talking. So if anybody has a question, just raise your hand, either electronically or if you can't figure out how to do it electronically, you can put it in the chat or just wave wildly in your picture. So we have two questions. Wayne, go ahead. You're first.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hey, come
Okay.
in, Wayne. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing pretty good. Hey, so my question is, uh, given your view that this was an external attack on the U.S., that they probably had access to and control of the media, um, to what extent do you believe that the powers that be could have still gotten us into the same global war on terror if the planes had missed the towers and hit other skyscrapers?
Hmm.
Do you think that would be, to me, first of all, I'll give you a little bit of background. I've looked at the flight data recorders and I am absolutely convinced that they are authentic and they provide direct evidence from manual control. And the question is, would the global war on terror have started if the planes didn't hit the targets they hit, but they hit someplace else, but they were still hijacked and we were attacked? Would the global war of terror that was central to 9/11 still have gone forward?
That's a really interesting question, Wayne. Thanks. And I respect your research on these other issues too. So I would argue no, I don't think it would have. I think that number one, the perpetrators would have been left holding the bag as they had these buildings rigged for demolition. And it might have been a bit difficult to figure out what to do with all of the demolition charges or whatever else they had done to prepare for their demolitions. Remember, uh, the entire World Trade Center was demolished. Every single building that had a WTC prefix was totaled. We often don't think about like building three, building six, and so on, but the whole thing was utterly total. And not one building without a WTC prefix was totaled or even damaged close to that level. So this was a demolition of the entire World Trade Center, of course, and in particular, the three famous skyscrapers were the explosive demolitions of the Twin Towers. What was the core symbol and the center of the psychological operation. The images of the planes hitting the towers, the firewall, rather the South Tower, the fireball, those images were important. But the most important images from the purpose of psychological warfare were the images of the buildings exploding and people eating pyroclastic clouds chasing people through the streets of New York, and the media announcing that 40,000 people were probably dead. And of course, that came down to 3,000 eventually. But that level of casualties, together with those images, were absolutely necessary to launch the global war on terror. at the level that it was launched or anything remotely close to that. And had those planes simply, gone off target and caused a few hundred casualties among people on the ground, plus, people lost their lives on the planes, I don't think that would have even been close to the same psychological effect. We would have had a similar kind of situation where, we had the African embassy bombings and we've had these various other terror events that tend to get forgotten pretty fast after they happen. And this would have been closer to that than to the effect that 9/11 had, because 9/11 steered history. It took history and made a 90-degree turn. And so we would be living in a totally different world had planes missed the Twin Towers and just kind of randomly veered off and clipped other targets.
Well, thank you. The only thing I'll point out is that there are the two other planes, the Pentagon, where only 160 or so people were killed, and Shanksville, in which only the passengers on the planes were. Those were central to in my opinion, the global war on terror also. So I thank you very much for your response.
Okay, thanks, Wayne.
Okay, and now Henry McLean. Go ahead, Henry.
Hi, folks. Can you hear me okay? Good. Kevin, I just was curious in terms of this discussion about the complicit aspects of the U.S. in 9/11. I mean, I hear this interesting concept of, it being an Israeli invasion on us, in a sense. How would you relate that to what happened on October 6th and our potential complicit ongoing activities with Israel in terms of that being a false flag event as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. When the October 7th raid happened, my first response was, as I watched it on the Arab media, my first response was kind of, well, it's about time they broke out of that concentration camp, and it looks like they are, far more successful in this operation than one would have expected, given that the Israelis have, built up such a strong, armed presence around the Gaza concentration camp. So I was initially a little suspicious, but it was very soon apparent that the strategic impact of the October 7th, 2023 Hamas raid on Israel was going to be rather different than the 9/11 fallout, right? In other words, with 9/11, the psychological impact of these images, including and starting with, of course, was, as I mentioned to Wayne, the explosive demolition of these buildings, which left such an indelible impression on the world, that everybody remembers that, and it's a turning point in history, whereas hardly anybody can remember any of the details around any of these other terror attacks, including ones that killed a lot of people, right? So 9/11 was obviously going to very, very, very powerfully change history, primarily by offering a path to the Zionists to hijack the American military and then use it to destroy Israel's enemies in the region, countries that should have been America's allies, but that the Israelis didn't like. So clearly 9/11 was going to create only one huge winner globally, and that's the state of Israel. And indeed, it saved Israel from possible bankruptcy and perhaps even disappearance. Naomi Klein mentions in the shock doctrine that Israel was facing a catastrophic financial situation prior to 9/11. They had invested all of their chips in anti-terror and surveillance startups. Basically, Israel shifted what little it had left as it was going under due to the dot-com bust. And they took all their chips at the beginning of 2001, and they put them all into anti-terror startups and surveillance startups. So when 9/11 happened, Israel hit the jackpot. Its catastrophic and probably terminal financial problem was solved. And that was just one of the many, many ways that they benefited, of course, along with hijacking the American military to do their dirty work. So 9/11 was such a massive advantage to Israel. They gained so enormously, and nobody else did, that from that who gains question, the answer is just so obvious that everybody in the world should know that Israel is the number one suspect in 9/11. However, with October 7th, 2023, it's not the same situation at all. Prior to that day, the Israelis had been having a lot of success in co-opting regional countries and paving the way for them to essentially come out in a very strong position, continue to dominate Palestine, perhaps even expand their borders one way or another a little bit, continue to increase their relative power, and yet manage to integrate themselves into the region enough that they actually had a chance to become a viable long-term entity without accepting the world's imposed, two-state solution that the entire world has been pushing for since 1967. So the Israelis were in a pretty strong position prior to that. With October 7th, suddenly they were in a terrible position because, well, first, the Israeli defense doctrine rests on this pillar of an image of invincibility. They convince everybody that they always are going to win. They're invincible. You can't beat Israel, and that had started to get chipped away at a little bit by Hezbollah in 2006. But October 7th, 2023, just blew that up, and Hamas scored a huge military win. I don't know, you've probably seen mostly the Western propaganda version of this, but if you're watching the international media, including pro-Western Arab media like Al Jazeera, Al Jazeera comes out of Qatar, which is occupied by the U.S. It's very pro-American, very liberal, pro-Western, but Al Jazeera also does real journalism on the ground. And so it's clear to everybody who follows the media that's actually reporting the facts that this raid was a huge military success. It was not deliberately targeting civilians at all in any way, shape, or form. Its mission was to, number one, take military hostages, and they took a lot of military hostages. Hamas won its shootouts with a number of the crack IDF battalions and got a lot of military hostages. And the Israelis actually killed the majority, probably the vast majority of Israeli civilians who died that day. There were over 1,000 Israelis died, but roughly a little over half were not civilians. They were either military or armed guards of some kind. And so the less than half that was civilians, most of them were killed by Israeli forces themselves under their Hannibal directive, which states that if there is a potential hostage situation, the Israeli military should murder everybody, hostages, prospective Israeli hostages, as well as hostage takers, to avoid the political liability of having hostages taken. So that's what they did. They just mowed people down from helicopter gunships. If you look at the cars around the music festival, they're all just destroyed by helicopter gunships. They just killed everybody in hundreds of cars. They utterly destroyed hundreds of their own cars, many of them full of people. They sent in tanks and blew up that kibbutz. There's, that kibbutz, those images of that poor kibbutz where all those people died. The kibbutz is just utterly obliterated. And those pictures were used to try to drum up sympathy and anger at Hamas, but Hamas didn't do that. Hamas only had light weapons, and this whole kibbutz was just utterly destroyed by tanks, and it was full of people, full of Israelis and some Hamas hostage takers. So anyway, what really happened was Hamas scored a valiant and courageous and very skillful military victory. And yes, they did grab some civilian hostages, and you can argue about whether Israeli settlers, are legitimate targets for that or not. I think they sure as heck are. But in any case, this was a military victory for Hamas. It sent the signal that you can beat Israel, which is not something that Israel would ever want. And it then put Israel in a situation where it was going to have to go into Gaza and try to fight the Hamas militarily. And Hamas had set up these tunnels and years worth of armaments. So Hamas is to this very day defeating Israel day after day after day in actual fights, and you can watch these on the Arab media. You can watch guys sprinting up to these tanks and dropping IEDs into the tanks, or magneting them onto the tank and sprinting away, and the tank's blowing up. Israel cannot defeat Hamas militarily. So they've been forced into this position where either they have to basically surrender and take a gigantic humiliation, or they can perpetrate genocide. They can just keep slaughtering women and children. And that's what they've been doing. They've been slaughtering women and children for 2 years, losing the military fight, and utterly and completely destroying their own legitimacy. So there won't be any Israel now in just a few years because of October 7th. Therefore, if the Israelis were complicit in setting up October 7th, or if any of them were, those were extremely stupid Israelis. And so the comparison with 9/11 is, light and black and white, night and day. 9/11 was a brilliant strategic coup by Israel. October 7th was a brilliant strategic coup by the Palestinian resistance. And if any Israelis were complicit in it, they made a terrible mistake because they just killed off their country. There won't be any Israel in just a few years.
Wow. Well, just to follow up on that, how do you interpret what's going on with Iran and the latest, I mean, this whole engagement now with the Trump administration? I don't know if we can, this is too off topic, but it's sort of, in my mind, is sort of the elephant in the room at this point, because the notion we're getting over here with the American media is that Israel has completely neutralized the Houthis. Well, we've helped them there, but we've neutralized the basically all of Israel's enemies, including Iran at this point. I mean, that's the message that's coming over in U.S. media. So I don't know if you had any further follow-up on that.
Yeah, I think that message is very distorted, to say the least. The Red Sea is still shut. I mean, there's most of the shipping is still, the Israeli port on the Red Sea is still dead. It's completely dead. And most international shippers have routed around the Red Sea because the Houthis own it. The U.S. military retreated. So this notion that the Houthis are under control is a joke. Iran won its exchange too. So Iran managed to pound Israel and destroy a whole lot of strategic sites, including Israel's biggest oil refinery that produces the majority of fuel used in Israel. It was destroyed. It's still not back in action. So the Iranians showed that they could get higher and higher and higher percentages of their missiles through and hit Israeli targets with total precision. And that's why the Israelis, after a week, went screaming to Trump to save them. And so then Trump, did his sort of gesture of saving them by bombing Iranian nuclear sites. But in doing so, he transformed Iran into a de facto nuclear weapon state. I highly recommend the talk by Ted Postal. He's probably the most knowledgeable nuclear weapons expert who's free to speak his mind in the English-speaking world. And he just did an interview last week in which he, basically proclaimed that today Iran is the Mideast's second de facto nuclear weapon state. And the reason for that is that Iran still has this huge cache of 70% enriched uranium, and enriching that up to the 90% that you need for the weapon is nothing. It's infinitely easier than getting it to the 70%. And all of that, that uranium was taken away in advance. I believe the Americans had the consideration to warn the Iranians, which is good because, we didn't want to have nuclear radiation flying around the region. But now Iran is in this position where it was subjected to a dastardly sneak attack by Israel with the backing of the United States, which had engaged in fake negotiations to provide a cover for Israel's attack, as Trump actually admitted. And then the IAEA, which has been monitoring the Iranian nuclear program, was also complicit in the attack. The night before the attack, the IAEA made some stupid PR announcement scripted by the Zionists that gave them some cover for their strike. So essentially, as Ted Postal said, Iran can make a nuclear weapon every 3 weeks, and they almost certainly are, because they would have to be crazy not to, but they're not going to tell us. So as of today, Iran is now a nuclear state, an undeclared nuclear weapon state. It has unstoppable missiles to deliver those nuclear weapons, as well as a huge amount of non-nuclear firepower. And so Israel, which did, of course, manage to not take down Hezbollah a couple of pegs, has had no such success against either the Houthis or even more so against the Islamic Republic of Iran, whose people are now rallied around their government and its hardest hardliners. There was just an article in, I think it was Foreign Affairs, an American mainstream outlet, pointing out that the new generation in Iran is a lot more hardline than the older one, and that the whole country has rallied around that interpretation. And now we have a majority of Iranians, a strong majority, who very much want to build nuclear weapons, which, of course, Iran probably already has. Israel has really, once again, dug its own grave. And the question is, why have the Israelis continued to do these dangerous and self-destructive things? And there's this guy, Elan Mizrahi, I think is his name. He's an Israeli, a Jewish guy who is just horrified by what's happening to his country. And he recently posted a short essay that said, there's some psychological death wish it's not just in Israel, it's in the Jewish tradition, where we just keep pushing things until we create a disaster. And I think he's onto something. I think the Israelis have taken these huge risks in the past, and they've gotten away with them sometimes just by the skin of their teeth. They sent both Harry Truman and Winston Churchill letter bombs. They murdered the Kennedys. They tried to kill George H.W. Bush in Madrid in 1991. They had their guy threatened to kill Obama during the Obama administration. They just had a prominent rabbi writing for the Times of Israel basically threaten Trump and say, Trump, the reason that the Epstein scandal is coming after you is because you didn't do what Israel told you to do and bomb all of Iran's nuclear sites the way you were supposed to. So there's this extremely reckless mentality in Israel that's tied into kind of Jewish millenarian messianic fervor. And that is, I think, the real deep reason for most of the extremist behavior coming out of the West in general and Israel in particular. And I think they've managed to create a very, very bad situation for themselves, both with this post-October 7th genocide and then picking this fight with Iran that they've already basically lost.
Well, do you think that could be hubris because they've gotten away with so much over the decades?
Yeah, I think it's chutzpah is actually, hubris is the Greek word for a kind of tragic flaw, but chutzpah is the Yiddish term for the guy who's arrested for killing his parents, and he pleads with the judge for mercy on the grounds that he's an orphan. And so that kind of chutzpah, that just over-the-top shamelessness and total psychopathy really describes the mindset of a lot of the Jewish elites, not just Israel, but the Jewish elites in general. I mean, the Jewish element of the American plutocracy or the oligarchy, which is probably maybe 40% of it-ish, something like about 40% maybe of America's richest billionaires happen to be Jewish. But there is a mentality among those people that is different from, the average WASP. And they also work together with tremendous ethnic nepotism. And that, there's this history, of course, of Jewish communities being heavily involved in organized crime. Usury used to be a crime, and they owned that racket. And from there, they also controlled, the international drug trades, including trades in alcohol, rum and sugar during the slave era and the Triangle. They, have controlled other international drug trades as well. The international human trafficking and prostitution that's still dominated by ethnic Jews in the West, at least. And Israel is the center of it. And so that history, which grows out of a history of Jews being a minority that had to survive by hook or by crook, and had a very, very aggressive, adversarial and amoral attitude towards the people around them, because that was a survival trait. Well, now they basically took over, and they're still operating that way. And I think that explains a whole lot of the just egregious, outrageous, hyper risky chutzpah that we see from the decision makers in the West.
Okay, next we have David Schlesinger. So go ahead, David.
Thank you. Let's see. Yes, I think you've answered my question, but I'm just going to confirm. Jimmy Dore, when he was saying that the Israelis knew that Hamas was coming on October 7th, he added that leadership of Hamas expected the genocide from Israel of huge numbers of Palestinians, and they were willing to accept that because they knew that that would turn the whole world against Israel, and that was their goal.
Well, I think that, kind of, I guess it depends what you mean by genocide, because the Israelis have been committing genocide against all of Palestine, since even before there was a state of Israel. They've essentially been persecuting, terrorizing, and using violence against the indigenous people of Palestine in an attempt to either kill them or get them to leave and eliminate Palestinian, culture and the Palestinian people from the face of the earth. That's what they've been doing ever since, even before they declared their so-called state in 1948. But in terms of Gaza, we have seen these repeated so-called mowings of the lawn, in which the Israelis create some minor pretext and then go in and drop white phosphorus and bombs and burn to death and blow up maybe a few thousand civilians in Gaza. It's happened several times, like 2008, was it mid-20? It's happened like 3 or 4 times, since 2008. And so, yeah, of course, Hamas expected that. They expected that Israel would kill many civilians in Gaza and do it in such a way that would basically turn the world against Israel. I'm sure that's true. Whether they expected it to be this outrageous and to go on this long, I don't know. I sure didn't. I thought that what we would see would be maybe a few weeks of mowing of the lawn, and once they killed 3,000 or 4,000 innocent people, as opposed to the 2,000 that was their previous world record in Gaza, that the world would at that point stop them and be so horrified that it would be a gigantic black eye for the state of Israel. And that even might be enough to discredit and delegitimize Israel. But I couldn't imagine that it would go on this long, that it would be this bloody, and that the Israeli people would chime in all over social media with these over-the-top, sadistic kinds of expressions of support for the most horrifying and sickening kinds of genocide. So, there are now literally tens, if not hundreds of thousands of social media posts out of Israel, all of them showing these outrages far beyond the most extreme portrayals of Nazis in Jewish film propaganda. Actual Israelis, basically showing them, raping and killing Palestinians, or basically advocating that sort of thing, tormenting Palestinian children, dressing up in the underwear of the women that they've killed, playing with the toys of the children that they've killed, and on and on and on and on and on. And then the witnesses to this are also on the record, hundreds of thousands of people on the record, having been witness to these. Today the Israeli snipers shoot kids in the head. So it's head day. So the international doctors in the hospital see nothing but head wounds and people with their heads blown off. The next day, it's crotch day. And so it's all the young male Palestinians with their testicles blown off. And the next, the Israelis, they do this for fun. And those of us following this stuff have known this for decades. We've seen them doing this. Back in 2003, Chris Hedges wrote about witnessing Israeli soldiers barking out over their bullhorns obscene insults to lure Palestinian children into range of their guns so they could be shot dead for sport. And Chris Hedges said, "I've seen the most horrible war crimes in Sarajevo here, in Afghanistan there, whatever, but I never before saw soldiers luring kids into their gun sites to shoot them for sport like I saw in occupied Gaza." And that was 20 years ago, but it's been going on, since 1948, even before. Thomas Suarez's book on State of Terror documents the just frenetic, over-the-top terrorism that was used to create the state of Israel in the first place. And they targeted their fellow Jews as well as the British and the Palestinians. So these people are just so far over the top. They're so far beyond even their own lying caricature of World War II Nazis that, and the whole world can see this now. And the young people who use social media see it a lot more than anyone else. And so I think that the reaction, this genocidal reaction from the Zionists, probably exceeded even what the Hamas strategists would have expected, and by so doing has essentially dug the grave of Israel that much faster and deeper.
Thanks.
Okay, Al Magaletta has.
Yeah, Kevin, a couple of questions. I've heard that Netanyahu and Israel have been or had been financing Hamas, and that it was a way of keeping himself in power and also ginning up the support of the world in playing the victim card. And the other question I have is, I've never been able to figure out how Hamas gets military supplies where the borders are supposedly so well defended, meaning Israel. That where are these Hamas fighters coming from, and are they all in tunnels? And it always amazes me that they've survived so long. When you listen to the Israel's propaganda, something doesn't add up in my mind. But anyway, those are two questions I kind of had wanting to get your opinion on.
Right. Well, it's true that Israel did fund Hamas at the very beginning. And when Hamas was founded by Sheikh Yassin, that was quite a long time ago. Was that like late 80s or 1990s? It was quite long ago. And at that time, the purpose of it was to try to create a counterforce against the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was having success in getting international legitimacy. And so the Israelis thought it would be in their interest to have infighting. And so it was the old divide and conquer strategy. Sheikh Yassin, I think, had been a prisoner in Israel, and the Israelis said, okay, we'll give you early release and give you some money if you start this group. And he said, sure. But within just a few years, the Israelis were starting to regret that they had done that, because Sheikh Yassin, as it turned out, was an honest and charismatic resistance leader. And then pretty soon, Hamas became a force to be reckoned with, along with these other groups. There are a number of, there's Islamic Jihad, which is more aligned with Iran than Hamas is. And then there are some left-wing groups as well. George Abdullah, the great Lebanese Palestinian resistance fighter, was just freed from prison in France after 40 years of imprisonment. He's a member of one of these left-wing groups. So there are a whole bunch of different resistance organizations that mostly coordinate their activities. So Israel did actually help start Hamas. That's true. But I think it's very likely that the official story is correct in that they quickly came to regret that. If you read the book Rise and Kill First by Ronan Bergman, who's sort of the official stenographer of the Mossad, he also writes for the New York Times. He, in that book, which is a history of Israel's targeted assassinations, he points out that the Israelis have a long history of creating these, basically, killing off one enemy, and then another worse enemy takes its place. And so here, to the extent they were able to harm the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which became the Palestinian Authority, they ended up with an even bigger problem, which was Hamas, which has gotten a lot of success. And it's funded by a wide variety of sources. Qatar is probably the biggest single funder of Hamas, which is interesting. I mentioned Qatar was essentially occupied by the U.S. And so one has to be a little suspicious of much of what Qatar does. But I think when Qatar was funding Hamas, it was because the Qatari leadership, along with the Al Jazeera media operation, they're all a bunch of true believing liberals. They believe in their journalistic mission under a liberal order, and so from their viewpoint, Hamas is a legitimate government in Gaza. Hamas did win the elections, uh, and then of course the U.S. and the Israelis tried to overturn the elections and bring in the PLO to attack Hamas, and that blew up in their face. So Hamas is viewed as the legitimately elected democratic government of Gaza by much of the world, including Qatar, which is why Qatar funds Hamas. And if the Americans don't like it, Qatar says, well, the way we see it, and all of the people in our region see it, is that this is a legitimate democratic government. And not only that, but the Israeli government doesn't really mind that we're doing this, has even cooperated a little bit, because again, yeah, it's true. The Israeli government finds the existence of Hamas as the hardline element of the Israeli government anyway, finds their existence as a way to try to deflect from keeping their international obligations under the Oslo Accords and the track towards the two-state solution. So the hardline elements of Israel have kind of nodded and winked as Qatar and also Turkey and Iran and plenty of private individuals all over the region, including, I'm sure, here in Morocco, are donating money to Hamas. And with money in today's world, you can, get anything you want. So it's, you can bribe people and get stuff into Gaza. There have been tunnels to Egypt, but there are also other crossings. And if you bribe the right people, you can get anything. And so that Hamas, they were able to get their construction equipment that they used to build tunnels legitimately. And this was all part of construction equipment that's used to build everything that's being built in Gaza. And so Hamas used some of that, along with this pile of money that they raised by being this really universally admired resistance group in the region, to build this fortified military architecture to try to discourage the Zionists from invading and trying to steal Gaza again. And then also, of course, to create this kind of situation that they're in now, where Israel cannot defeat them militarily. The fortifications are too strong, and primarily the human factor is too strong. The Hamas fighters are very, high morale, willing to die for their cause because they know their cause is just. And the Israelis are just the opposite. So I think that it's a kind of a complicated situation, but the short version is that essentially the entire region here where I live supports Hamas. Anybody with money that could possibly get it to Hamas will do so if they can do it without, getting caught by Israelis or Americans. The Qataris and maybe the Turks have been able to send huge piles of money to Hamas with the approval of the Israelis. So it's not that surprising to me that Hamas and other Palestinian resistance groups have been able to put up as powerful of a fight as they did on October 7th and have been doing ever since.
Okay, Mike Biga has his hand raised. Go ahead, Mike.
Yep. And hi, Kevin. I agree with you on almost
Hey,
all
Mike.
your analysis. As far as 7 October, though, I mean, for me, just the day after, it was almost clear that many key people within the Israeli government had to collude with that and let it happen. But that's, another point. We can discuss that. I know you're open to some people having knowledge.
I think that's possible. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, they still have informants in Hamas. They had them. And just signal intelligence, I mean, as thousands of people organized before they came in. And you're probably familiar with the troop movements, calling off border patrol, moving troops away, disarming some people. There's a lot there. But separate from that, I want to think about the strategy going forward. And I think it's interesting. One, I would say Hamas does benefit from people waking up to the insanity for forever since Israel and before. But they were open to, something kind of along the lines of two states. I mean, they had a lot of ceasefire agreements they put forward, and we know that Israel wanted to prosecute, what they're doing to Gaza. So I actually think Hamas, would have cut it off with, a number of these ceasefires. Yet Israel wants to, continue what they're doing. But I would say in the West, and I think you're kind of bullish on, armed resistance, working in the future, right? And I think it's an open question. But the sad thing is, Israel has always wanted to fight, on the level of force. They've fomented resistance, and they've used that resistance to enable, let's say, the Nakba, and then all sorts of things since then. So I guess what I would say is, and it's still debatable where this will go, but I'd be worried, given what we know about 9/11, what they might envision for the coming years, where they may prevail militarily, and obviously we would call it a quote unquote final solution, where they would do a Nakba 3, right? I mean, we have the Nakba, we have the mini Nakba, we have the slow rolling genocide, which is since Israel started. But I guess I wonder where you are there. I actually kind of think they're crafting a lot of the Muslim world to think we can win by force of arms, whereas Israel's confident that we got tactical nukes, we got the U.S., we're inculcating the entire West with a level of Islamophobia, right? So it is also very, and another thing is interesting in the West, we have people who are waking up to actual history and actual current events, but we also have people who are still being inculcated with just base Islamophobia and all the insanity you see on the internet. So I guess one, I think Hamas has showed openness to not go down this path. So I don't think it was them trying to get, slaughtered and use it for propaganda, although it does work for their cause, and they acknowledge that, I'm sure. But yeah, I guess I'd be worried about where it goes in the future. So I guess all that being said, feel free to comment on what you want. But I also think, thinking forward, what do you think about a disaster happening, if we're talking about armed conflict and it going the wrong way, and specifically right in line with Zionist expansionism?
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like you're kind of hinting at the possibility of another huge 9/11 style event that would be used to justify essentially this final solution of murdering millions of Palestinians and expelling the rest. There are currently maybe 7 million Palestinians in and around historic Palestine, or actually I guess, and so that is, they've so far the Zionists have perhaps killed during, since October 7th, 2 years ago, they've killed some, maybe a few 100,000 people in Gaza. The official numbers are, of course, much lower, but the real number of people killed is probably a few 100,000. So Gaza's population may have been reduced from 2.2 million to 2 million or a little less. If the Zionists decided to just go ahead and try to slaughter millions of people, they would need a better excuse, of course. And they might very well try another 9/11 kind of situation. What that could be, I would, I don't know whether they would be, unleashing a nuke on an American city or something like that, and then they could use that both to create the hysteria that would allow them to get away with whatever they're doing, but it also could draw the U.S. into that war on Iran, because suddenly it would be another, Saddam might get WMD situation. Only, of course, Iran now is an undeclared potential nuclear weapon state. Nobody except very few people really would even know if and how many nuclear weapons Iran has. But the Israelis seem to be committed to trying to defeat Iran somehow, or what that would mean, I'm not sure. But 9/11, of course, was aimed at overthrowing or destroying 7 countries in 5 years. And it's behind schedule, and Iran was number 7 and by far the most important country on that list. So yes, I think you're right to be worried about the possibility of another huge false flag that would be designed to allow the Zionists to even expand their genocide beyond the level it's at now, and then possibly also draw the U.S. into a much bigger war with Iran. And of course, there are factors pushing against that too, which is that so many people are now awake to this. All kinds of, for every Ron Johnson in the U.S. Senate who comes out and basically endorses, the 9/11 truth movement, there are probably, dozens, if not hundreds, of other people at high levels of responsibility in the United States who are waking up to the reality of the situation and who would be highly suspicious if, let's say, a nuke went off in an American
Yep.
city and all the Zionists were trying to blame Iran, I don't know if they'd be caught flat-footed the way they were in 2001. So it would be an even bigger gamble that very well might backfire on the Zionists if they tried that. Now, as far as the future of armed struggle for liberation, I'm in favor of trying to not to avoid violence as much as possible, right? If there's any possible way of not using violence and that's going to work better, I'm all in favor of making that choice. I just want to be clear about that. But the history as we see it today, has unrolled in this particular way, and it's not at all clear that there's going to be a quick answer to the use of force to leverage power in the world. And I wish there were. If anybody,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so
Yeah,
then,
yeah.
yeah, but
Oh, sorry.
you were implying with your question that the West is so powerful and Israel is so powerful that challenging them militarily, hasn't worked in the past and it might work even less well in the future. Well, that's possible, but I think the West and Israel are actually going off a cliff in terms of their relative power compared to the rest of the world, and that within 10 years, it will be absolutely clear to everyone that China is the dominant military power in the world. Russia is number two, and the U.S. is a distant number three. And when that happens, as soon as that's clear, that's the end of Israel. So the idea that the military power equation favors Israel and not Palestine, that's wrong. The U.S. has gone from 50% of global GDP right after World War II to 15% and sinking right now, and the West following it. Europe is just going down the toilet, and Russia is winning its war. China is in a position to win when the U.S. finally is going to come in and attack it in the South China Sea, which it probably will. So I think that the liberation of the non-Western world by military force, because that's ultimately the arbiter of power, is happening as we speak. And so part of that is the liberation of the Holy Land. And it'd be nice if we could figure out an alternative way to do all this without using military power. If that starts happening, I'll be the first one to be, to praise God and don't pass the ammunition. But
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's a dangerous time because I agree with you with the waning power, at least of the U.S. as their ally, executing what they want in that region. And another thing, aside from a false flag, I don't know about you, but I lived there briefly. I lived in the West Bank, but you definitely feel that they're going to attack Al-Aqsa. So if they foment a regional war with serious missiles, let's say with Iran and maybe a few other actors, if they were to have an errant missile or someone blows up Al-Aqsa, then it's pure mayhem. But I do think they could prevail, with their Western allies if there's absolute mayhem. And they've kind of primed the entire Israeli population, or 80%, right? I mean, you've probably seen the polls that are so horrific of the Israeli mentality. Do you support ethnic cleansing, let's say, of Gaza or entire of Israel proper, right? So I think they have enough people who could, do vigilante vigilante, terrorism like they do daily in the West Bank. But I do worry about them kind of hitting the Al-Aqsa, if I can say that properly, Al-Aqsa button. So there probably would be false flags in the West as well to make sure you have political support. But I kind of worry about them taking that path. I don't want to underestimate a Zionist, to use a Bushism. But I do think at the same time we have information, and I also want to say I don't disagree at all with armed resistance within their territories, but when it's used outside of that and it gets twisted by Israel, there can be issues with how it gets played in the West, of course, right? So I mean, you probably align on. We probably know exactly. We know what happened on 7 October. We know there's a lot of lies, as you spoke to earlier. But yeah, no, I guess that's it. It's going to be an interesting coming few years.
Yeah, if the Zionists do try to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque, I think that would be a perfect example of their extreme chutzpah biting off more than they can chew, because every regional country would then have to unite against them. And like right now we have like, Jordan and Iraq and stuff, allowing Americans to use their airspace. Qatar allowing Americans to use their military bases to support Israel. If they blow up Al-Aqsa, I mean, everybody in the region will, just unite with resistance.
Yeah.
So
Right. And I don't
it'd
know
be a
if they
super
think
boost.
they'll survive. Yeah, I don't know if they think they'll survive as a larger single state Sparta after the mayhem that goes on. I mean, even when they hit Iran, I think probably me and you probably thought there was a more Iran is a rational actor. They do not want to get destroyed, so it was strategic. But I was actually surprised how restrained they were. And it wouldn't be necessarily a devastating attack, but if they hit it, I'm just thinking about to get the level of what they want to orchestrate, which is pure regional mayhem, but something they think they can game their way out of. But yeah, no, appreciate your insights there.
Yeah, thanks, Mike.
And thanks for giving me so much time, everyone.
Next, we have Magnus. He's phoning in from Norway. So go ahead, Magnus.
Thank you. Magnus from Norway here. Yeah, I didn't know about Building 7 until 2016 and started to show it to firefighters and had a lot of videos. I got very sad for watching. And then I suddenly found it to be Koopa's Towers in Super Mario and Larry's Castle 7. So I was wondering what kind of crime, what kind of figure is Larry Silverstein? Do you have anything on that to comment?
Well, I don't really have new information on Larry Silverstein, but I've been talking about him for a long time now. I did actually just republish my Larry Silverstein Chutzpah Award trophy. I did this graphic of a trophy in the form of a mock-up of Building 7 with Larry Silverstein. This Larry Silverstein Chutzpah Award. I give it to whoever deserves it. Lately, I think this week it was that rabbi who boasted that Israel has the Epstein tapes and Israel created the scandal that's dogging Trump to punish Trump for not blowing up enough Iranian nuclear sites. So I thought so he won the Chutzpah Award. And I called it the Larry Silverstein Chutzpah Award because, Larry Silverstein's, asking for double indemnity on his insurance money, claiming that there were two separate and unrelated terrorist attacks on 9/11, namely the two planes. And this is after he's gone on the record stating that he was party to a decision to demolish or pull Building 7. That illustrates the concept of chutzpah very accurately. But yeah, Larry Silverstein has become sort of the poster boy for this, classically Jewish Zionist attitude of extreme chutzpah, right? Larry Silverstein managed to purchase the World Trade Center just 2 months before 9/11. This is after the towers have been basically condemned for asbestos, but it's going to be uneconomical to find any normal way to demolish them. So whoever owns them is going to lose, billions of dollars. And so he wins, and he doesn't even have the high bid, but he's still awarded ownership of the World Trade Center 2 months before 9/11. And who is he? Well, Larry Silverstein is a reputed organized crime figure who got his start in the illicit sex trade. He had strip clubs. He was allegedly involved in prostitution and the drug running that occurs in those strip clubs, et cetera, et cetera. He used his organized crime money to build a real estate empire. He's a close friend of Netanyahu. According to Haaretz, Israel's most reliable newspaper, Netanyahu and Silverstein talk extensively every single weekend. They're very close friends. So this is the guy who bought 9/11 2 months before, or bought the Trade Center 2 months before 9/11. He doubled the insurance money. He changed the terms to cash payout. And then in the aftermath, he demanded double indemnity. So he doubled and he redoubled. So he put down something like $16 million of his own money and a little over $100 million of his partner's money on the down payment on the World Trade Center. And then he raked in something like a total, I think it was like 4.8 or 5, about $5 billion with a B in insurance money. And then used that to rebuild, the towers, rebuild the Trade Center, and who knows what else he's done with that money. And all of this, plus he's on record on the America Rebuilds interview on PBS, stating that he was there when they made that decision to pull. They watched it collapse, talking about the demolition of Building 7. So and then he also, of course, was supposed to, he ate breakfast every single day at the window to the World's Restaurant at the top of the North Tower. But on 9/11, he failed to show up. And his excuse later was that his wife had just reminded him that he had a dentist appointment right as he was walking out the door. And I guess his daughter also miraculously survived, even though normally she would have been in that same restaurant every morning, too. So Larry Silverstein is sort of the poster child for this like extreme chutzpah in terms of just blatant, obvious complicity, confessing, doubling and redoubling insurance money, being, on the phone with Netanyahu every weekend, and then none of this, it makes it into the mainstream media, which is illustrating the thesis that we all know who dominates mainstream media. So I find talking about Larry Silverstein is often a good way to open up this whole issue.
Okay.
Thank you so much for answering. I just wanted to ask you, are you updated on the 9/11 Crime Scene to Courtroom film series we are making right now? I'm a co-producer and helper. We are now making a full film series for the grand juries. 9/11 Crime Scene to Courtroom, 911c2c.org.
Great. Okay. Hope you can come on my podcast to talk about that when it's ready.
Yeah,
I will request Richard to do that.
actually, Crime Scene Courtroom is a collaboration between Richard Gage, 911.org, and the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry.
Great.
It's going to be long time coming, but it'll be great. So next we have Wayne Costa again. Go ahead, Wayne.
Yeah, Kevin, thanks for all the background information here. This may be a little off topic a little bit, but can you talk about the Israeli connections with Azerbaijan and what's going on there? They seem to be distant from Israel physically, but they seem to be getting closer. Can you talk about that? Over.
Sure, that's one of those geopolitical issues, and we all know in geopolitics, countries don't have permanent friends or enemies. They keep playing their cards to try to maximize their power, and so the just to try to summarize what I understand about this, I'm not really an expert, but Azerbaijan was part of the Soviet Union. It got its independence in 1991 when the Soviet Union broke up. It's historically had been part of Iran, and the people are predominantly Shia Muslim. But under the USSR, which discouraged religion, they had been largely forcibly secularized. So Azerbaijan has been at loggerheads with its neighbor Armenia, which was also part of the USSR and then became independent. And they have border disputes going back for quite some time. Now, since Azerbaijan had been part of Iran, there's always that tension in which they want to sort of assert themselves against Iran. And so Iran has tended to ally with Armenia against Azerbaijan. And since the Azerbaijanis are not only Shia Muslim, but they also, many of them are Turkic peoples. The Turkish government which has always been in rivalry, right? Ever since the Ottoman Empire was fighting with the Persian Empire, the Turks have had this rivalry with the Persians. Those are the two big non-Arabic speaking peoples in that area. And so Turkey has generally allied with Azerbaijan, whereas Russia and Iran have allied with Armenia. Since Iran has become Israel's public enemy number one, the Israelis are, of course, running around with carrots and sticks trying to get help from anybody they can against Iran. And of course, Azerbaijan has been somewhat open to that. as have certain Kurdish groups. So that's the kind of the short version of why the Azerbaijani government has been relatively close to Israel and cooperated with Israel and leaned against Iran. It's interestingly, of course, President Ibrahim Raisi of Iran was probably murdered flying home from Azerbaijan, possibly with the complicity of Azerbaijan and its is likely Israeli allies who probably took down that plane. The so I'm not sure, how much detail it would be worth going into in all of this, but it does seem, unfortunate. We see over and over in these kinds of conflicts. It appears to me anyway that the people causing the lion's share of the trouble, the people exacerbating the conflicts and pushing them into violence, are disproportionately the Americans and the Israelis, the people that the Iranians accurately call the Great Satan and the Little Satan. That is that, this natural sort of, rivalry between Iran and Azerbaijan probably would, actually be relatively peaceful and so on if the Azerbaijanis weren't being, prodded and bribed and cajoled and pressured and stuff from the Israelis and maybe the Americans too.
Okay, great. We have David Schlesinger again.
Thanks so much. I want to raise the dancing. Let's see. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. The dancing Israeli issue. Max Blumenthal, who I thought was anti-Zionist, has actually, his gray zone has dealt with the so-called dancing Israelis acting like that's not evidence that 9/11 was a false flag. And the other piece of evidence about those people is that some of them were on Israeli TV soon after they returned to Israel. And many of you know what a terrible researcher I am. You, Kevin, are a great researcher. Does you or anybody know how I can access those Israeli TV footage?
Well, it used to be all over YouTube, and it probably has been largely purged from YouTube, but I'm sure you can find it pretty easily. I mean, just, feed the term dancing Israelis into, say, the Yandex search engine. If you want to find this kind of material, it's hard to do it through Google these days. Unfortunately, Google is heavily censored. But if you go to Yandex, which is the Russian search engine, there are no such strictures. And so
Yandex? Yandex?
Yandex, yeah.
Okay.
And you'll find lots of Dancing Israeli archives, like What Really Happened has a Dancing Israeli archive, and Wikispooks has a Dancing Israeli archive, and I'm sure other places do as well.
Thank you.
All right, next we have Mike Figa again. Go ahead, Mike.
All right, so yeah, I wanted to talk about the backstory of the hijackers in quotes. High level, I view them as some useful idiots and just entirely manufactured backstories. And Wayne believes that they were piloted into the buildings. I think if you wire the buildings for destruction, you have to use remote guidance. What exactly happened prior to that, I don't know. But I was hoping you could maybe speak to that a bit and maybe even provide some best sources to piece together the kind of ridiculous backstory we have with all the hijackers, it seems. And also, I don't know if you know David Rovix. I put a link in the chat, but Rovix was friends with a guy who, knew someone who met the Israelis in Hollywood, Florida. So, right next to the hijackers. As we know, Israeli Mossad was basically shadowing every quote unquote cell.
Yeah, I've talked to David Rovix about that on my podcast. I really like David Rovix. We had a little falling out at one point because he did this great 9/11 truth song, shortly after 9/11 called 9/11
Reichstag Fire.
Yeah. And then he kind of backed off and he wanted to distance himself from the truth movement and so on. But, I've interviewed him on and off over the years, and I really like him. I admire him. He's another of these people from ethnic Jewish backgrounds who are really, really good people. just as we find criminal types, disproportionately from a Jewish background, we also find critical truth-seeking intellectuals disproportionately from that background. And David is a good example of that. So getting to the hijacker issue, one of the most interesting sources for that is the book Welcome to Terrorland by Daniel Hopsicker. Hopsicker is one of those alternative journalists from before the internet era who learned how to do gumshoe work on the ground, who went down to Florida after 9/11 and interviewed everybody he could find. And what he discovered was that these alleged hijackers had been engaging in all kinds of really bizarre behavior. That number one, two of the flight schools where they were supposedly training that I think that those were both around Hollywood, were owned by a couple of organized crime figures that Hopsicker called the Magic Dutch Boys. They had CIA drug smuggling connections, or we assume it was CIA anyway, because at the same time that Muhammad Atta was pretending to learn to fly, which he wasn't actually doing, but he was showing up there and going through the motions. He already actually had a flight capability higher than the lessons he was signed up for there, so that was just purely for show. Anyway, Atta was getting basically all the cocaine that you could ever distribute to all of your hundreds of friends and girlfriends. He was getting that from the people who were bringing it through that airstrip. And that airstrip was a CIA-related drug import airstrip. It was a flight school in name only. There's no record whatsoever that it had a single actual flight customer. And during the period that Muhammad Atta was showing up there, pretending to sign up for flying lessons, the biggest drug seizure in the entire history of Florida happened as a Learjet that was owned by a certain reputed organized crime figure named Wally Hilliard of Green Bay, Wisconsin, was seized by the Drug Enforcement Administration, filled to the brim with heroin. And the plane was then returned to Mr. Hilliard with apologies. And maybe they returned his heroin too, although that wasn't put on the record. Turns out it was, of course, CIA authorized. So that's the people that Atta was hanging out with there. And Hopsicker also found that Atta had, was a party animal. The original Atta from Germany was known as being very soft-spoken and pious. And this Muhammad Atta, who was signed up for flight lessons in Hollywood, was the opposite. He was very loud, very obnoxious, and kind of cruel. He disemboweled a kitten of his pink-haired stripper girlfriend, Amanda Keller. And many of the other alleged hijackers had similar kinds of reports. And of course, we'd had, among the many, many, many reports along these lines, we had the mainstream media reports from bartenders and customers at that. I think it was in the so-called, these alleged hijackers who supposedly boarded the plane at Dulles, which then later supposedly hit the Pentagon. Those guys were, according to the witnesses, they were up at bar time, 2 a.m. on September 10th. And remember, they supposedly are going to be on these planes at 7 or 8 in the morning or something and lining up for the planes. So they were out till bar time at 2 a.m. on September 10th, and they left alcohol-soaked Qurans on the bar. So, and you could go on and on with these preposterous kinds of eyewitness reports about these so-called hijackers. Just one of my favorites, of course, is one of Graham McQueen's favorites is Muhammad Atta visits the Small Business Administration. So Atta barged into a Small Business Administration office. He may not even have had an appointment, I forget. And he demanded I think it was like a $500,000 loan in cash on the spot to buy a crop duster airplane. And he hinted that he was going to use it to drop chemical or biological weapons on Washington, D.C. He expressed great admiration for Osama bin Laden. He pointed at a huge aerial photo of Washington, D.C. that was behind the desk in that office and demanded that it be taken off the wall so he could bring it home and use it. Now, this kind of behavior, of course, would be completely inconceivable and unthinkable if there was really this crack team led by the ringleader, Muhammad Atta, that was somehow going to, evade the entire American surveillance apparatus and pull off, the biggest terror attack of all time. These are the kinds of reports that, along with other reports showing identity problems with many of the hijackers, just for one example, Ziad Jarrah, who was, 15 of these 19 guys were Saudis, and they were all in the U.S. on a special CIA visa that the CIA gives to CIA agents, right? So we had 15 Saudi CIA agents who were posing as hijackers, and then we had like four other guys, and one of them, Ziad Jarrah, is from a clan or a family that works for Israel in the heroin business in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon. And if you look at the documentation on Ziad Jarrah in the lead up to 9/11, you find there were three different people with federal U.S. ID pretending to be Ziad Jarrah. Here he is with his passport, here he is with his driver's license, and here he is with whatever else it was. And they're all obviously three different people who don't even remotely look alike. So these are the sorts of things that make it really clear to me anyway that the whole hijacking story is utterly and completely bogus. There's not a shred of evidence that any of these 19 guys or any other Arabs or any other people with the slightest notion of hijacking anything even boarded any of these planes. And not only is there no such evidence, but there is abundant evidence proving that they can't have. And that evidence consists of the fact that the United States government was obliged under international law to produce the evidence that those guys were on the planes, and it failed to produce it in the form of actual ticket stubs, eyewitness reports from the people who ticketed and boarded them, and certified passenger lists. Not one of those three things has ever been released, as Elias Davidson makes clear in his work. So I'm on your side on this, and I think Wayne is completely wrong, that it's just beyond obvious that this story of these alleged hijackers was a total ludicrous cover that blew up, and that indeed remote piloting must have been used.
Yep, in New York City. And I agree. And there was one other pilot. He wanted to take off, but didn't want to learn how to land. I mean, these are just obviously people creating a backstory. I mean, it's bar none. We have a lot of that kind of obvious cutout situation going on.
Right.
Thank you.
If these guys had actually been capable of pulling off 9/11, they would have had some tradecraft. And if you actually study this story left by these guys, they couldn't fly planes. They had no tradecraft. They were obviously acting out a story, and they were all probably about 75 IQ for the most part, except Mohammed Atta, who was a fluent speaker of Hebrew. He was the ringleader, and he was probably Israeli, the so-called Mohammed Atta, who was running around Florida.
Yep.
Thank you. Next we have Henry McLean again.
Yeah. Hi. Kevin, this has just been wonderful. I really appreciate everything you're sharing. And I have a couple related questions. One, since we spoke about Larry Silverstein, I'm wondering if you wanted to share what you know about Howard Lutnick, who lost 685 employees as the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald and is now our Commerce Secretary. And that sort of ties into the question of any thoughts on what the Trump administration willingness is to expose this 9/11 business? And related to that, there's another fellow called Carl Schwartz, who you may have heard of, wrote a book called One Way Ticket Back to Crawford, Texas. He was apparently a Republican insider who's recently come out again with a couple of interviews on the UK channel, talking about the whole fossil fuel discussion of getting the U.S. military over there to begin with is sort of the real reason behind 9/11 from the American perspective. And tied into that is, I think, what I heard you say about the U.S. being sort of dwarfed now by potential Russian and Chinese military. But the data we're getting here is that the U.S. spends more on defense than the next 9 countries combined. And that's from the Peter Peterson Foundation. Again, I don't know. This is what we're reading at this end. So I know there's a lot there, but I just, these are sort of burning questions in my head about all this business.
Yeah, those are a bunch of interesting ones. Well, this, Lutnick, Cantor Fitzgerald, and the Trump administration. I don't know too much about the specifics of him, but I certainly don't think that the Trump administration is a 9/11 truth administration. That's
Yeah.
pretty obvious. I think it's pretty likely that Trump was inserted into the presidency by the state of Israel or by the hardline faction there, the Netanyahu faction, which probably was, rather than Russiagate in 2016, it should have been Israelgate. There are reports that in the summer of 2016, representatives of Israel or Netanyahu approached Trump and basically made him an offer he couldn't refuse. He had no chance unless they jumped in on his side, and at which point he would have a chance, and he accepted that offer. And then they mobilized their social media operations and things like that, put him in the White House. And the reason they did that was that they had basically already reached an understanding with him about allowing Netanyahu to do whatever he wants in terms of move the embassy to Jerusalem, force these so-called Abraham Accords down the throats of U.S. vassals in the region, and ultimately set the stage for war with Iran by way of destroying or tearing up the JCPOA nuclear agreement. So all of those things were the reasons that Israel, not Russia, inserted Trump in power, and I'm sure they own him. Israel, Trump was Jeffrey Epstein's best friend for a decade, and admitted that, or all but admitted that he shared Epstein's taste for those women that he sure likes them young, and so it seems highly probable, especially given the testimony from Katie, the 13-year-old that Trump raped so brutally on multiple occasions, in at least once in the company of Epstein, and the 10 other children, both male and female, who've had their silence bought by Trump for his rapes of these children. That Israel undoubtedly has blackmail material on Trump, and that's why he's been doing all of these totally preposterous things that even the most Zionist-friendly American leaders would never dream of doing.
Yeah.
So yeah, Trump is not. He's never going to bring out 9/11 truth unless somehow he would he decided to totally turn on his Zionist masters and go full Nazi or something, which you can't quite put that past him. But yeah, that's so. And then as far as the military equation.
Well, just before we leave that, Howard Lutnick apparently did the same thing. He missed 9/11. He lost his brother. He lost his best friend. He had 680 employees, and he was essentially his alibi was that he was taking his kid to kindergarten that day. And there's an interview with him on Larry King, which seemed pretty real back right after the event. But it's just curious that he was brought in by Trump to be the transition director of this new administration, and brought in RFK and brought in apparently Elon Musk. So it's curious to me that also that Trump has said on multiple, and he's quoted from various places saying that those buildings more than likely were exploded. So I don't know if you have any comment on that, but it just seems like he's straddling the fence at least.
Yeah, well, before he was elected in 2016, some folks had some hope, and I mean, I sort of enjoyed the way he was shaking up the discourse on 9/11. I have to admit.
Right.
Yeah. A friend of mine was at Trump's rally in Michigan, where my friend interrupted him, and Trump actually froze. Usually he doesn't, but in this case, that he's said something about the dancing Muslims on 9/11, and my friend yelled, "Hey, Trump, it wasn't dancing Muslims, it was dancing Israelis." And Trump just froze. And then the security guards jumped on my friend and started dragging him off. And then Trump yelled, "Hey, he's on our side. Be nice to him." So there were all these kinds of things going on. Trump is obviously kind of a loose cannon. And I got to plug in my computer before it dies. But I don't think he's such a loose cannon that he's likely to blow the 9/11 thing wide open, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. Well, and again, the military, if you want to comment on that briefly, I mean, just the military expenditure that I mentioned.
Yeah, so it's true. The U.S. Spends more money on this military than the next 7 or 8 countries combined. But of course, that's in terms of non-adjusted dollars or currencies. But if you rewrite it in terms of purchasing power parity, then you find that it's actually the U.S. advantage largely evaporates. And in terms of real world issues of like, what does this money buy? Well, number one, manufacturing capacity. We're seeing today that Russia is slowly grinding down Ukraine because Russian manufacturing capacity, apparently military capacity, dwarfs that, or at least, beats that of the whole United West, of Europe plus the US. And, the EU, or, they have like what, 500 million people or something, considerably more than the, 350 million or whatever in the US. And they should have a bigger GDP, but Russia is still out manufacturing them. And to understand why that's possible, you have to get into the personal purchasing power parity, and then the question of real economies. What's his name? I'm Andrei Martynov has done good work on this, showing why this American military advantage is largely illusory. And so along with the manufacturing capacity, which wins wars, that's, the US won World War II because it had such powerful manufacturing. And then Russia was able to defeat Germany also because it was able to build such a powerful manufacturing capacity. And today, the US is not so great for manufacturing, and neither is Europe, really. Russia and especially China have a huge advantage. And then there's finally the human resources. And in that area, China has an immense advantage. China has like, what, 1.5 billion people. Their average IQ is about 110, as opposed to Western IQs at about 100. Now, that might not seem like much of an advantage, really, but what it actually means is that when you look at, how many people do they have over, say, IQ 140 or over, let's say, IQ 160, China has, I forget if it's like maybe like 50 times as many people as the entire West over IQ 150, and like, hundreds of times more over IQ, say 175, something like that. In any case, they're human resource, and then they plug all that into science and engineering. So these toilet paper dollars that the US has in abundance, that we've been pointing our guns at the world to force everybody to accept, look impressive. But if you look beneath the surface, it's not so impressive, and it won't be too long before they get flushed.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful to hear. Well, not wonderful, but it helps to understand it. Appreciate it.
Okay, next we have Steve Andrews. Go ahead, Steve.
Hi, longtime fan. I wanted to ask and mention something about Muhammad Atta. He was a regular on Jack Abramoff's Sun Cruise casino boats. And Jack Abramoff was this Republican lobbyist that eventually went to prison for bribery or something. And it seems really clear that he was Mossad. So it's odd that Muhammad Atta would be a regular on this Sun Cruise boat. And I'm no expert on Islam. I know Muslims are not supposed to drink it. I don't think they're supposed to gamble either. So he clearly was not acting as a pious Muslim would be. I believe that comes from Dana Hopsicker. But have you ever heard about Jack Abramoff and Sun Cruise and the connection there?
Yeah, I remember reading that, I think, in Hopsicker, and I think that also made the mainstream media. And also, Atta and other alleged hijackers used to jet regularly to Las Vegas for gambling junkets. So they were big-time gamblers. It looked like they had some kind of deal where that whatever, they thought their job was, and who knows, some sort of combination of military intelligence and organized crime, they were being given wads of cash and unlimited cocaine and gambling junkets. That was, they're being told it was their cover story for something. Who knows what it was? But yeah, and that's of course totally contradictory to Islam. And it's also contrary to Muhammad Atta's personality, the real Atta, who was very shy, very pious, and you would never imagine him doing any of those things. And you certainly wouldn't imagine him being fluent in Hebrew either. So I think it's pretty clear that there was an Israeli who was impersonating Atta in Florida.
Thank you. I'm next. So let's see, trying to spotlight. There we go. Yeah. I wanted to roll back to what you said much earlier about inside job versus outside job. And there just does seem to be a lot of pre-knowledge uh, evidence of pre-knowledge from the Bush administration, which points to an inside job as well. So if you could address that, please.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, I think the term inside job, you could argue for it uh, by analogy with a bank robbery that's an inside job. Okay. So if a bank gets robbed and you figure out that somebody working at the bank had to have been complicit for this robbery to get pulled off the way it was, you would call it an inside job, even if it was robbed by, John Dillinger and his gang. So we all know the Dillinger gang did it, but they had help on the inside. And that's how I would look at 9/11. The Israeli Zionist gang did it, and they had help on the inside. But I think the idea that it was primarily like about trying to improve access to oil, or it was primarily about American geostrategic primacy, which is the way David Ray Griffin tended to look at it, I think is mistaken. Now, I think the Israelis behind it probably sold it to some of their American assets and their American dupes with that description. But I think that it's really clear that the beneficiary was Israel, and that the U.S. has been a net loser in every way that you want to measure. The U.S. would be much more powerful and prosperous if it hadn't wasted $7 or $8 trillion on these counterproductive wars in the Middle East, which have to some extent imposed relatively pro-Israel regimes on many of those countries, but that hasn't done anything for the U.S. Most of the more independent regional leaders that the U.S. got rid of, like Gaddafi and especially Saddam Hussein, were perfectly willing to work with and trade with the United States. Indeed, the Islamic Republic of Iran would be happy. In fact, they're lobbying for U.S. dropping sanctions and coming in with investments and win-win deals. And they probably, they don't think about opening a Trump Tower in Tehran, I'm sure. But support for the Palestinian resistance is non-negotiable. Nobody in the region with the slightest shred of integrity will make that negotiable. And I say that here in Morocco, which is not really in the region, so I guess I can offer the government here a slight pass. But that position is incredibly unpopular here and everywhere else, especially closer to Palestine. So anyway, Israel obviously was the beneficiary. The job was done by that particular outfit, and they had help on the inside.
So your view would be that the administration were basically useful idiots to advance their project for the new American century?
I think the whole new American century shtick was, a lot of it was cover. Like when the project for a new American century was all a bunch of Jewish Zionists with a couple of goy names for camouflage, Rumsfeld and Cheney and so on, and that was basically organized after the clean break document was put out from Netanyahu's office in, was it like 97, 96, 7, towards mid to late 90s. The Benjamin Netanyahu commissioned a document whose lead author was Richard Pearl. And that document laid out how Israel was going to destroy its enemies in the region and totally transcend its enemies, not just defeat them, but actually transcend them by completely redrawing everything in the region. That was a blueprint for what they wanted to accomplish. The only way, of course, anything like that could happen would be with a 9/11 and getting the Americans on board. So they wrote that. And then Richard Pearl and Wolfowitz, his associate, they started PNAC, Project for a New American Century. Well, they didn't clear, it's not about American, it's about Israel. And, if you want more money for the American military budget, which they did, the only reason for that is so it can protect, what's important to them, which is Israel. So PNAC was basically a disguise. It was these Netanyahu extreme Likudnik Zionists pretending to be American patriots who want to double the American military budget and so on and so forth, in order to have American military power prevail for the next century. And it's true that those people probably do want a very, rabid and powerful American military, but the only reason they want that is because that is an advantage for Israel.
Thank you. Magnus is up next. Go ahead, Magnus.
Thank you. I was doing some research and I found a video where the Port Authority is worried about that Building 7 is going to collapse next. And then I found it. Do you know anything about this Louis Eisenberg in the charge of the Port Authority on 9/11?
Okay, I'm sorry. What was the two
Louis
issues?
Eisenberg. Louis Eisenberg was in charge at the Port Authority on 9/11, and the Port Authority was concerned that World Trade Center 7 was going to collapse. Do you think he had prior knowledge?
Yes, I think Eisenberg was probably part of this whole thing. I mean, the Port Authority did transfer the ownership to Larry Silverstein on a non-high bid contract 2 months before 9/11, and Eisenberg was a key part of that. And I think Frank Lowy was his partner at the Port Authority, if I recall. And both of these guys are arch Zionist, Israeli loyalist Jewish billionaires, bigwig Republican financiers. And so, yeah, I would actually, view 9/11 sort of in the same way I would view the Epstein scandal, in that these Jewish Zionist billionaires who cooperate with Israeli intelligence, who work with the Israeli intelligence, they're sort of like these super Saanim, right? The Saanim are Jewish people all over the world who will volunteer their time for Mossad for free because of their loyalty to their people. And these Jewish billionaires are kind of like that, only they're so powerful that it becomes a question of, does Mossad tell them what to do, or do they tell Mossad what to do? But in any case, I think, these guys, Eisenberg and Lowy, are in that class. I can't remember if they're formally part of the mega group, MEGA, which is the group of Jewish Zionist American billionaires that was essentially created Jeffrey Epstein. That Epstein was, in my view, he was never an actual billionaire. Epstein was just handpicked by Israeli intelligence to play this role when he was young, and he was, sheep dipped in this girls' school because Epstein loved to seduce young girls. He had satyriasis, which is male nymphomania, and so he was recruited. He was made a math teacher at a girls' school, even though there's no evidence he actually knows any math, but he certainly knows about girls. And he practiced there, got really good at what he did with young girls. And then, Maxwell, family Mossad person, ends up working with him as he's given, they create a bank account for him with billions of dollars. It's not his money. You say, okay, your cover story is you're going to be an investment manager. But Epstein didn't know anything about investing. There's no evidence he ever made a penny through any knowledge of investing. And so he plays this role, but it's what you call a legend in the intelligence world, which means a cover story. So he was just an Israeli intelligence agent, and he worked for these billionaires. And so I think that the billionaires who privatized the World Trade Center ahead of 9/11 were essentially like the mega group people behind Jeffrey Epstein, and they certainly were involved and would have had some prior knowledge on a need-to-know basis.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's all our questions. Did you have a closing statement you wanted to make before we wrap this up?
Not really, other than it's been a pleasure to speak with all of you and to see people, including old friends, and hear really good questions. I mean, they're all really excellent. So, and also, I think we should be positive and optimistic right now as 9/11 Truth keeps coming out to bigger audiences. Through Tucker Carlson, who's apologized to people like me that he used to insult, and now he realizes that we were right. And he brings on Senator Ron Johnson, the Wisconsin Republican. After I was persecuted by Wisconsin Republicans in the mid-2000s, now the biggest Wisconsin Republican is a 9/11 truther, Senator Ron Johnson. So there's some movement here. and hopefully it'll continue, God willing. And I appreciate the contribution that all of you are making.
I just want to comment on Ron Johnson. He did a turnaround on 9/11 because of Raul Angulo of Protecting All Protectors Alliance. He interviewed Kurt Weldon, who's a former congressman and a former firefighter, who said he's absolutely outraged about the lies about Building 7 and 9/11 in general. So that convinced Ron Johnson. And as far as Tucker Carlson goes, I think he felt betrayed by Fox News when they let him go so ruthlessly, so that when you feel betrayed, you kind of reevaluate your values and who you trusted. And he has recently, I think a couple of months ago, said when he was questioned about his opposition to 9/11 truthers in the past, he said, "I deeply regret it. I was a child."
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah. So it's amazing what's going on. And Kurt Weldon is working on getting a presidential commission on 9/11 to the Trump administration. But Trump is a wild card, so we don't know how far that's going to go.
Yeah, well, I think that's a long shot with Trump, but who knows how many more people will be coming out, like Tucker Carlson and Ron Johnson.
Right. And so I just wanted to let you know that inside skinny that Raul Angulo, fire chief from Seattle, former fire chief from Seattle, and his conversations with Kurt Weldon, that's really what drove the recent activity we're seeing on 9/11.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, good for Kurt Weldon. I always was a fan of his work, and I remember when he was in his heyday there, still in Congress. They hadn't kicked him out yet. Bringing forth Anthony Schaefer's information. That was a very exciting time, and I'm glad he's still hanging in there.
Yeah. He's fired up. He's mad as hell. Watched any of his interviews. It looks like he's about to have a heart attack. He gets so excited.
Yeah.
Kevin, I have one final question. Do you have a contact email that we could follow up with you?
Yeah, sure. My main email is truthjihad. So that's all run together, truthjihad@gmail.com.
So much appreciate your taking time. I know it's really late for you right now. What time is it there?
It's about 10 minutes to 9, which is perfect because at 9 I meet with my sons and we have a language learning session.
Oh, wonderful. Well, so you've really informed us with your tremendous amount of research. And I think and I want to thank all our participants for their excellent questions. And there was so much in the chat, which I haven't been able to review yet. So that will be also released when we release the recording. It looked like some really good comments in the chat as well. And it's been an honor, a true honor. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Susan. Take care.
You too.